I don't know how many of you remember Richard Dawkins. I want to say Family Feud, right? Isn't that Richard Dawkins? Dawson. Oh, so it's not. Okay, this is a different person then. I don't even remember Richard Dawkins. But I guess he was a known, a pretty well-known atheist. And he had this to say. He said, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. You get the idea that where he stands in this. All fiction. And the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, a misogynist, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, here's that word, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Tell us what you really think, Mr. Dawkins. I want you to take a moment. We're in tables today, so we can do this. Take a moment and just your gut response, share that with somebody next to you. Like, when you read this description of God as the God of the Old Testament, what do you think? Share that with somebody at the table with you. Just nudge. All right. I want to hear a few thoughts initially. What was your initial thought to this? He doesn't know the God I know. What else? He's not very smart, or he is very smart? He missed the mark. Okay. I'm listening with my man ears. Okay, so he's probably a little bitter. He has a very dark view of who this God is, right? He's never read the Bible, right? So this is the thing, and Tom always stealing my thunder, once again. Those of us schooled from infancy in God's ways can become desensitized to their horror. I want you to think a little bit about some of the stories of the Bible. I mean, what if I told you that I think Dawkins' picture of God may be more accurate than the picture most believers have of God? Having had you spoke out loud, you're probably ready to come after me now. But I wanted you to kind of think about this and really absorb this understanding of how an outsider thinks about our God. But we also have to think about the inside view of God. I think most believers picture God as softer and cuddlier than the Bible presents him. I want you to think for a minute. Have you, okay, it was probably Julie's idea, I'm just saying. But we decorated our son's nursery. What was the theme? Noah's Ark. Have you seen that movie? Have you read that story? So our son grew up with the theme of the destruction of the entire world surrounding his crib. Have you ever watched Charlton Heston's 10 Commandments? I remember as a kid when the plagues came on, I wanted to hide my eyes and run out of the room, and I didn't sleep at night because of this horribly violent, vindictive God that would do all of those things to those poor Egyptian people. See, we lose the horror of these stories and how fierce and ferocious our God can be. Here's another one. How many of you in your living rooms Or we'll just say anywhere in your house. Maybe it's even in your bedroom or downstairs in the man cave or out in the garage, wherever you put the man cave, your she shed, wherever. How many of you have a picture of an electric chair hanging in your house? Anybody? Anybody? This instrument of torture and punishment hanging in your living room or right above your table. Anybody? Okay, let's try this one. Anybody have a cross up in their house? Raise your hands. Same thing. Earlier version. See, it's so easy for us to think of this soft, cuddly God. But like Brian Jones says in his book about hell, hell is real. And all of Dawkins' accusations, as Tom has pointed out to us, can be seen in Scripture, or at least appear to be seen there. And not just in the Old Testament. And so what I want to do today is, rather than go through all these different passages, because I've been warned I need to preach a shorter message today, because, you all have eaten, and, there's only so long between when you eat and when you're ready to be done in a room full of people. So I'm going to try and keep it shorter. But so rather than going through point by point about what he said, I just want you to think for a moment. Is God jealous? Yeah, and he's proud of it. He takes no shame in saying, I am jealous of you. Is God petty? That one's hard for me. But if I'm super honest about the things that he says and the rules that he makes, we'll go past the Big Ten and let's just go to the rules for the priesthood. Like there's 611, commandments. So let's just talk about, okay, isn't it a little petty that you have to wear a certain type of underwear to enter the Holy of Holies? And only one person can do that, and only once a year, and only after all of these different standards have been met. I'll just say that for some people, not understanding God's holiness or God's authority, that might seem a bit petty, right? Unjust. We talked about this last week. Everlasting torment because I disobeyed my parents? Does the punishment fit the crime? We struggle with that idea. Some people would say, well, that doesn't seem just or right. Unforgiving, control freak. It's hard to say this, but honestly, when God sets the standards for how to approach the Holy of Holies and how to carry the Ark of the Covenant, and a couple of guys trip, and somebody reaches out to try and help out and keep from damaging the important temple equipment, and they're struck dead, that doesn't seem very forgiving. That seems like that can't work. Vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser. That one's tough, right? It's like, well, you're acting like Hitler was acting on behalf of God. Do you know what? There was a time or two that God said, destroy everybody in that land, and when the people hesitated to, what did God do? He punished them. There's a picture of God in the Old Testament that fits that. I don't know about misogynistic because I don't even really know what that word means most of the time. But my guess is if I were female and I were reading the Old Testament and I read some of the Old Testament laws and how the standards were different for men than women, I might have Mr. Dawkins' opinion about that. We could go on and on. My point is that you could probably find an understanding of why he said that about each of those things by reading Scripture. So does that mean that God is nothing more than this? Like this bully? I don't know what to do with that. So here's what I want to do. I want to go through just a couple of passages and help us recover an accurate understanding of who God is. The first one is, I'm going to go through Psalm 58. And I'm going to read through this whole thing, and I'm going to read it in a paraphrase, the Message paraphrase. And if you remember, when we did the book of Psalms earlier in the year, I showed you an interview between Bono and Eugene Peterson. Bono, the lead singer in U2, which I found this out this week, Rabbit Trail. Did you know that Bono did not like the name of the band U2? Like from the very beginning. U2 was named after the U2 spy plane, and he hated that idea that their band would be called that. And you know why they went with the name of it? Because it would look cool on t-shirts, right? And they sold a lot of t-shirts. But Bono, if you remember the interview with him and with Eugene Peterson, which may not be as common of a name to all of you, but he was a preacher who lived up in Montana, on one of the most beautiful places in the world, right on Flathead Lake. And he took the entire Bible eventually, but it started with the book of Philippians that we're going to read next year together and study together. He started with the book of Philippians, and he translated it for his Sunday school class so that it could be easier for them to understand, because it's an old book, the Bible, right? And that became such a popular thing in his class, he went ahead and eventually did that for the entire Bible. And that's the Message paraphrase that we have today. Well, I want to read this part because I don't know if you remember the interview, but in there, Bono is talking about how truth-filled Scripture is and how, if honest the Psalms are, and if we would just read them at face value and understand them, it would change our picture of who God is. And he used a very specific image and a translation of Psalm 58, kind of his own paraphrase of Mr. Peterson's paraphrase. And he said, he talked about God punching somebody in the face. Just punch him in the face, God. And I remember at the time kind of reacting to that translation like, what? That's not the God I read about at Hallmark or on the Hallmark Channel or anything like that. Nobody preaches about a punch you in the face kind of God. But listen to Psalm 58 from the very beginning. And I'm going to pause in 3 places here just to make sure you're getting his point. So this psalm is attributed to David the king, but it's kind of funny because it's talking about political leaders. And I didn't pick this one because we're in a political season, but you're going to laugh at how appropriate it is to the current season. Here it is. Verse 1. Is this any way to run a country? Right? That hasn't changed. Is this any way to run a country? Is there an honest politician in the house? And here's what I want to emphasize. Behind the scenes, you weave webs of deceit. Behind closed doors, you make deals with demons. That's his interpretation of verse 2 of this psalm. In other words, he's looking at the environment around him, and he says, our political leaders, those that are in charge of us, and understand this, he's talking about kings, but it's written to King David, so I don't know quite what to do with this. Neither did the translators either, because if you read 6 different versions, this is going to look completely different in each version. Like, whether this is about the kings or the people, it's really uncertain. I think it's pretty clear it's about political leaders in general. But he says, behind the scenes, you're making the deals with the devil, and you're supposed to be representing the people. Now, in their time, the kings were seen as an extension of God. They were ordained, not just elected. Their calling was to serve on behalf of God, and they were making deals with demons. That's his translation. Let's go to verse 3. The wicked crawl from the wrong side of the cradle. Their first words out of the womb are lies, poison, lethal rattlesnake poison. It doesn't say rattlesnake, that's his interpretation of it as rattlesnake. Vipers, same thing. Absolutely deadly. He lives in Montana, so the deadly snakes are the rattlesnakes. Maybe down here we would say what? Like copperheads, water moccasins. Like, this is the stuff that kills. And that poison drips from their forked tongues. Deaf to threats, deaf to charms, decades of wax built up in their ears. Talk about a visual image of a politician ignoring the cries of their people. It's like they got wax built up in their ears. And then I'm going to emphasize this part. This is the part that Bono translated, that God punches them in the mouth. God This is Eugene Peterson's version. Smash their teeth to bits. Leave them toothless tigers. Ever felt that way about a politician? Then you understand the spirit of this psalm. There is a sense in which this psalmist is saying, these people are making deals with the devil. God, destroy them. Hit them in the face, punch them in the mouth, leave them. I mean, I don't know what, toothless tiger kind of sounds fun to me. I mean, could you imagine they go to maul you and they just gum you to death and slobber all over you? It's like they can't really rip you to shreds the way they're built to. Let their lives be buckets of water spilled. All that's left, a damp stain in the sand. Wow. We're supposed to honor our public servants, but this guy's saying, let's just dry them up into, pour out their lives and let it fade away. Let them be trampled grass worn smooth by the traffic. Let them dissolve into snail slime. Be a miscarried fetus. That's a hard one to say, but it's in the text. That never sees sunlight. Before what they cook up is half done, God, throw it out with the garbage. You get the idea that this psalmist feels strongly about his political leaders. The righteous will call up their friends when they see the wicked get their reward. Serve up their blood in goblets as they toast one another. Everyone cheering, it's worth it to play by the rules. And God handing out trophies and tending the earth. This is such a visual picture of how a believer maybe should understand the wrath of God. I don't know what all this psalmist understood, but one thing he understood was though the political leaders were powerful, his God was more powerful and capable of pouring out his wrath on people, especially those that were taking advantage of other people. I think when we talk about apocalyptic urgency, we should remember this psalm. Because apocalyptic urgency that I introduced last week, it's not about saving people from hell. You know, have you ever wondered that when people tell you, I'm saved? Well, what were you saved from? A lot of times people, they really don't know what that is. Well, I'm saved from my life of sin. Well, what does that mean? Well, some people say, well, I was saved from my addictions. Well, good for you. I'm glad you're done with your addictions. I want that for you. Or I'm saved from, my marriage was falling apart. This was my parents' deal. My parents' marriage was falling apart. And my mom gave an ultimatum to my dad and said, no more. If I'm going to raise these kids alone, it's going to be in our own house where I can make the rules and not think you're going to show up later on. You either are in or you're out, but you make a decision, and Dad decided he was in, and the only way he could get in was if God somehow could make that happen for him because things were a mess. And so, maybe God saved my marriage, but do you understand that we're not saved from hell? This is not about saving your friends and your family from hell. This is about saving people from God. I love how Brian Jones put that in his book, because it made me think, who needs saved from God? After all, God's a big cuddly teddy bear, isn't he? I mean, I was thinking, we sing this song about a sloppy wet kiss. Do you know which one I'm talking about? Yeah. We sing this song about a sloppy wet kiss, that God loves us and he embraces us, and it's like a sloppy wet kiss. The same guy that wrote that song wrote a song called The God of Wrath. And it's true. God loves us, and he pours out his love on us, and like a sloppy wet kiss, he's generous with it. He's reckless with his love for us. But he also has a fierce wrath because of his love for us. These things are not exclusive in nature. As we talked a little bit last week, hell is not a made-up idea. Even Jesus taught on it. I taught forever on it last week. Probably thought you were in hell. Hell is real. No doubt about it. And it's horrible. But understand that God himself should strike fear into our hearts. We should understand who he is and what it is about him. Turn, if you would, to another psalm, Psalm 90. And I want us to look at just a short picture, a small picture from Psalm 90. If we read this whole psalm, you get a better picture of it. It's actually one that we celebrate and we sing, and several things in here that we just find joy in, like, at the very beginning, Lord, you've been our dwelling place through all generations. He's the one that has sheltered them. They sing and worship this way. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth from the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you're God. But then look what he says. You turn men back to dust, returning to dust, O sons of men. For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. You sweep men away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass in the morning. And all of a sudden, some of us are sitting here thinking, I think Richard Dawkins might be right. This is a fierce, fierce God. Though in the morning it springs up new, by evening it's dry and withered. Verse 7, and this is what I want us to focus on here. We are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. I think I put a different translation in here. The NLT, New Living Translation. We wither beneath your anger and are overwhelmed by your fury. When was the last time we were overwhelmed by God's fury? Probably the last time we actually read Noah's Ark instead of just telling the story from a kid's book. The last time we actually looked at the scriptures instead of listening about them on the radio. I have yet to hear, I love K-Love. I have a friend from high school who is on that radio program. I can't even think of his name now. I just moved to Nashville. What? Yeah, Scott, and the Scott and Kelly show. And I don't know who he's with right now, but Scott and I were in high school together. And Scott and I were in choir together, and Scott and I raised all kinds of trouble together. But and I love listening to Scott. I love reading his Facebook posts. I like hearing his spots on K-Love. It's always positive and encouraging. That's what they're famous for. But I've yet to hear him talk about the wrath of God, or even play the song God of Wrath. It's just not warm and fuzzy. But we should have a sense of the overwhelming fury of God. Unless we think this is just an Old Testament God, like Mr. Dawkins suggested to us, maybe we should read a little bit of the New Testament as well. I could go on and on with examples from the Old Testament, but you can too, probably. Even Mr. Dawkins probably could. But in the New Testament, this wrath, this fury shows up too. It's just not always as easy to spot. I want to read this from the Message translation so you get it. But in Romans chapter 1, Mr. Peterson paraphrases this passage in this way. And I think it's a little easier for us to understand and identify with. I'm going to start down at verse 18. Actually, verse 16. He doesn't divide things evenly by verses. But God's angry displeasure erupts as acts of human mistrust and wrongdoing and lying accumulate, as people try to put a shroud over the truth. But the basic reality of God is plain enough. Open your eyes, and there it is. By taking a long and thoughtful look at what God has created, people have always been able to see what their eyes, as such, can't see. Eternal power, for instance, and the mystery of his divine being. So nobody has a good excuse. What happened was this. Now focus in. People knew God perfectly well. But when they didn't treat him like God, refusing to worship him, they trivialized themselves into silliness and confusion so that there was neither sense nor direction left in their lives. They pretended to know it all, but they were illiterate regarding life. They traded the glory of God, who holds the whole world in his hands, for cheap figurines you can buy at any roadside stand. So God said, in effect, if that's what you want, that's what you get. It wasn't long before they were living in a pig pen, smeared with filth, filthy inside and out, and all this because they traded the true God for a fake God and worshiped the God they made instead of the God who made them, the God we bless, the God who blesses us, oh yes. And worse followed. Refusing to know God, they soon didn't know how to be human either. Women didn't know how to be women. Men didn't know how to be men. Sexually confused, they abused and defiled one another. Women with women, men with men, all lust, no love. And then they paid for it. Oh, how they paid for it. Emptied of God and love, godless and loveless. And since they didn't bother to acknowledge God, God quit bothering them and let them run loose. And I want you to see this on the screen. Since they didn't bother to acknowledge God, God quit bothering them and let them run loose. And then all hell broke loose. Rampant evil, grabbing and grasping, vicious backstabbing. They made life hell on earth. With their envy, wanton killing, bickering, and cheating. Look at them, mean-spirited, venomous, fork-tongued God-bashers, bullies, swaggerers, insufferable windbags. If we were to continue reading this, one of the things we would discover as we got into the next chapter is he's talking about us. That our sin, he turned us over to it. He let us get involved in it. He let us do life our own way, and our own way turned into kind of a mess, or as he described it, hell on earth. You ever felt like there can't be a hell because you're going through hell on earth? There's a lot of people that feel that way. As a matter of fact, I would say many people in this room have had the opportunity to live a season of life that felt like hell on earth. Now here's the tough part about the teaching. God once sent Jesus to save us from more than just hell on earth. And God sent Jesus to save us from more than just hell. God sent Jesus to save us from himself and his own wrath being poured out on our lives. Because he is a just God, but he satisfied his justice. And I'll just tell you, you're going to hear this 50 times before you even begin to understand it. It takes time to understand this part. But God is punishing and pouring out his wrath because he loves us too much to live that way. He loves us too much to let us continue to live that way. And what I mean by that way is separated from him. The Bible also tells us every good and perfect gift is from God. God gives us this beautiful gift of grace through Jesus Christ that not only spares us from hell and spares us from hell on earth, but it creates a brand new type of relationship with him that's built on love and trust, his faithfulness to us. So while God is a wrathful God, he is a loving God. And his love and his wrath, it's a huge mystery. None of us are going to figure it out the first time we hear about it or think about it. But when you dwell on this week and understand that God's wrath and his love, they're two sides of the same coin. The bottom line is that God will completely unleash his wrath on those who choose evil over him. No doubt about that. And can I just say that if you've ever felt like the guy that wrote Psalm 58, like God just smashed their teeth in, because you can't. You and I can't do that. We're not supposed to release our anger. God says, let me return it. Let me handle the vengeance. You give that up to me. I'll take care of that in your life. There's a part of us that is grateful for God's wrath. We don't have to pour out our wrath because someday they're going to get what they want or what they deserve. Unless, like me, someday they turn their life over to Jesus and he decides to forgive it. But it's not my decision, it's God's, right? Here's the next thing I think we need to draw from this. we have the opportunity to warn and rescue people, not only from hell, but from God. So when somebody comes up to you next time and their excuse for not being able to have a conversation about God, or their thought about, I don't believe in a God who can let these things happen, maybe you're more prepared to help them understand why you do believe in a God that can let those things happen. Because most of those things that happen go back to this fact that God went ahead and turned us over to those things because it's what we wanted. It's what people chose. I mean, even like he talks in there about infanticide. Do you understand that when Paul wrote Romans, it was not unusual for a household that had children already and had a baby they didn't want, whether it be a little girl or a little boy, it wasn't unusual for them to just leave them outside the door of the house and let them go, let them die. It also wasn't unusual for Christians to come along and take them in as their own, as expressions of God's love. So when we read about this idea of infanticide, that was happening in Paul's day, and yet the church was responding to that. God gave the church a chance to respond in love to these things, but God also punishes these people who were doing that stuff. And that's part of the thing. When we look at these things that anger us and frustrate us so much, we have to remember that God is punishing people. That's how this wrath gets released and why. So the question is, how can we save people from God's wrath or from God? How can we do that? Aren't we powerless to do that? Well, only God can save, but he sent Jesus and invited us into that process. How can we save people from God's wrath? We begin to introduce people to Jesus. And that's what we're about as a church. That's why we're here today. I want each of us to have that understanding and know that God will save people. His wrath, people can be spared, but it's up to us. We have to dare to walk across the street and talk with people. Friday, I had been finishing up my message, kind of this portion, the application part of my message, and I was trying to get the lawn mowed. It looked like it was going to rain, and I had trouble getting the lawnmower going, and I finally got, I was getting frustrated with that, and this guy walks over from across the street. It's my neighbor's brother, okay? And he's there a lot. Like, I don't know what else this guy does, but he's just often at his sister's house. And he's there, he comes over, he says, hey, can you jump my car? Because it just won't start. And I'm like, oh, I want to get the lawn mowed before it rains. So I go and get the jumper box. I said, have you ever used one of these? He's like, no, I haven't ever used one of those. I'm like, oh, man, I thought I was just going to hand him the box, but so then I walk across the street and we get under the hood and people that are absolutely not mechanically inclined, they are way ahead of the game than I am, But because I've been having problems with the battery, or I had been, I ended up getting this jumper box, and so I had it and I hooked it up and, probably watched YouTube 30 times to figure out how to jump start my car, So I tried to jump this guy's car, and I'm thinking, let this start right away, please, and click. The good news is, I can jump start a car that will jump start. Beyond that, nope, beyond my ability. I can go mow my yard, But no, I said, okay, let's just leave it here for a while. I'll go mow, and when it gets done, you just, let me know or whatever. And he's looking kind of funny. It's getting close to the dinner hour. I said, is there somewhere you're supposed to go? Or are you supposed to be picking the girls up from school or band or whatever? You got anywhere you were trying to go? He said, well, yeah, I was trying to go to the store. And I'm like, okay, well, if this doesn't work, I'll take you to the store. But I'm going to go mow. So I'm out there mowing my front yard or whatever. He comes over and he said, yeah, it's still not starting. Can you give me a ride to the store? Well, in the meantime, my son called from Tennessee. And so now I'm talking to him, trying to you take advantage of those calls when they come. They don't come very often. So I'm trying to talk to my son. I said, okay, as soon as I get off the phone with him, I will come over there, and then I'll come back and mow the yard, and it's starting to sprinkle just a little bit. So I hang up with my son, and I go over there, and he's on the phone now. This guy's on the phone. Like, So anyway, I get in the car, and we start talking, and I really haven't known this guy. We've had maybe a conversation or two, but they're usually something like, hey, yeah, that's the conversation. Man talk, So we have this, we start talking, we're in the car, and we're past hey, like, what do you say next? Like, so how do you spend your time? That's my question. And he's like, well, I don't know, kind of doing this. Like, oh, what? Well, I fell and broke my back when I was about 25 years old. He worked on a rig, and he worked in a plant. And he said, so they wanted me on disability, and I said no. And I'm looking at this guy thinking, man, at 25, so you've been on disability for 15, 20 years. Ugh. Nope, he went back to work, even though they told him not to. 7 years later, it happened again. He fell and broke his back again. And so now he's on disability, and he's constantly in pain. And at this point, I'm like, hey, should I turn left or right? I forgot to ask you what store you needed to go to. He said, oh, I was just going to run up to the liquor store. I'm going to go back and mow my yard. This guy's like, so I take him, and I said, so do you take a lot of medication because of your pain? He said, no, I just drink a lot. And I said, oh, well, yeah, there's some ups and downs to that too, aren't there? He said, nope, just ups. All right, I'm not going to argue with you. I want to get my lawn mowed, And he got what he needed, which probably would have started my mower if it wasn't an electric mower. But took him back to the house and dropped him off and got his name, and we'll talk again. As much as I didn't want to walk across the street or get to know him or get started in his life, I now know how to pray for Brandon. And I know that there is a God that loves him so much. He doesn't want to pour out his wrath on him. He's poured out his love through Jesus on the cross. While Brandon was still stuck in his pain and his sorrow and his grief and his sin, Jesus Christ died for him that he could have hope forever and ever and have new life on earth, a new relationship with God. I tell you this about hell, not so you scare the hell out of your friends, but that you will see your friends in a way that says, God, I want them to know this side of you. I don't want them to have the view of you that Richard Dawkins has. I want them to know the cuddlier, softer side of God, because God is tender-hearted. To you, to me, to those that accept his love and grace, he is so tender-hearted. We need to represent and introduce people to that God. Let's stand. And I just want to, as you're listening and singing through this song, would you take time to thank God for his wrath and for satisfying it in Jesus?